Thank you, John. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and a special thanks to Father Gruner for inviting us, and it's a delight to be here. I've worked with Father Gruner in the past, and it's always been a joy. John didn't mention the fact that I grew up in a small community known as Brooklyn, New York. And I love to tell a story about the Anglican vicar who arrived in New York City. And he got in a cab, and he said to the cab driver, "My good man, please take me to Christ Church." Well, the cabbie took him to St. Patrick's Cathedral, an Irish Catholic cab driver. And the vicar said, "My good man, I thought I said Christ Church." And the cabbie said, "If he's in town, he's in there." I'll be using a PowerPoint here, so a lot of what I say will be up on the screen, and I hope that the thing continues to work. One world government, one world religion. Now, we have to go back to 1776. Of course, the 4th of July is what most Americans would recognize as an important date. But on May 1st of 1776, a man named Adam Weishaupt formed the Illuminati conspiracy to rule the world. And it was on May 1st, which is why communists and socialists always celebrate May Day, and most of them don't know why. I think more members of the John Birch Society understand that than do communists and socialists. Anyway, well, Weishaupt eventually was succeeded in this conspiracy by a man named Giuseppe Mazzini, who formed the Carbonari out of Italy, and they issued the Alta Vendita, the plans to cease frontal attacks on the church and to then send your people in there to infiltrate the church, right? Now, if you're going to set up a one-world government, you're certainly not going to ignore the Catholic Church, right? And they didn't. Well, after the Carbonari and the Alta Vendita, the instructions to send your people in there, came Marx and Engels with the Communist Manifesto, 1848. Let me make a simple point here that socialism can be more deadly than communism. Why is that? Communists seize control, and the resistance is still there. And so they have to have KGB and secret police and gulags and everything else. Socialism takes over a country because the people vote themselves into the condition, and the resistance is destroyed. Socialism, I don't know how many times I've heard people say, well, at least they're not communists, they're socialists. They don't understand. We move on and we see House and Wilson. Edward Mandell House, the architect, a man I consider to be the godfather of the United Nations. And Wilson, he had control of President Wilson, who was elected in 1912 and served until 1921. And then Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was also a disciple of Edward Mandell House, and that's not as well known as it should be. And House and Wilson tried the League of Nations and failed. Roosevelt wanted the United Nations, and he succeeded. Now, let's get on to the religious side of it here. This is a very dramatic thing here. This is on the left, you see a painting by a Belgian named Bruegel, who did his depiction of what the Tower of Babel might have looked like in 1620. And in recent times, the Council of Europe, which is a portion of the European Council, came out with their own reconstruction of the Tower of Babel. What's significant about the Tower of Babel? I think most everybody knows the story that these people were building a tower to reach to the heavens and to take control of the world and so forth. And God came down and said, no, you're not going to do that. And he confused the tongues. So the people who could speak with each other went off here and formed a nation. And people who could speak some other language went off here and formed their nation, and this one and that one and that one. The beginning of nationhood occurred at the Tower of Babel. Nationhood was created by God Almighty. Nationhood, therefore, is good. One world government is bad. I should mention here, too, that you can see a crane and construction on the right-hand portion of this. The stars above are not stars, they're pentagrams satanic pentagrams. And this was something produced by the European Union as much as 30 years ago. Now, we see in the period 1903 to 1914, the great St. Pius X, the Pope of our church, and he and his Secretary of State, Cardinal Merry del Val, who was an Englishman, by the way, with a Spanish name, they were great foes of modernism. Modernism and Masonry are, in many respects, the same thing. They came out with the encyclical, the Pope's encyclical Pascendi in 1910, condemning modernism. Right? You have to know about that. I can't dwell on it, haven't got time. But you have to know that modernism is a problem. Now, they also tried to clean house. They got rid of several priests. Priests were excommunicated. You were a modernist, you're out of here, right? One of the priests who was excommunicated was a man named George Tyrrell. And he said, I don't know if this is exactly what he said, I don't have the exact quote, but he said, "Not all have been dealt with, we shall return even stronger," right? So what he was saying and what the Pope knew was that they hadn't cleaned the house completely. They did a good job. They bought us time, I guess we could say. European Union's Council of Europe, well, we went over that, the painting by the Belgian artist Bruegel, depicting the duplicate of the Tower of Babel and the stars of satanic pentagrams. Now, the European Union has, of course, been amassing more and more power. They now have 28 formally independent nations in the European Union. They've given up their sovereignty, right? And it is a subsidiary of the United Nations. I've studied some of the documents of the European Union. United Nations is all over it, right? I wonder sometimes if those 28 nations are what we could look to see that some nations have been annihilated, right? I know that's part of our Fatima message. I just don't know, but I speculate about that from time to time. Now, in 1978, right in the middle of the 34-day papacy of Pope John Paul I, he only lived 34 days as a pope, a magazine came out in Italy called Osservatore Politico. The date is there, September 22, 1978. And the headline in the article was La Gran Loggia Vaticana, right? The Grand Lodge of the Vatican. And the man had published this information asking the Vatican to respond. Within his article, he's quoting from an Italian magazine, Il Messaggero, and it said this. It said, "For the first time in history of modern Masonry, a pope has not died in a state of hostilities with Masonry," meaning Paul VI. Paul VI, evidently, to these people, was obviously not hostile to Masonry. Well, the article was written by a man named Mino Pecorelli. And Pecorelli said in his article, "Let us either have a deluge of denials or, if there is silence, a purgation, a getting rid of these people." Now, what did they publish in this article? They published the names of over 120 prelates of the Catholic Church, their dates of entry into Masonry, and their code names. The article is headlined, La lista di presunti masoni. I'm not very good at Italian, but anyway, the list of the presumed or alleged Masons, right? So Pecorelli was asking the Vatican to respond. Who's on the list? Well, I've mentioned some of the names, 120, I couldn't put them all on the list. Villot was the Secretary of State, Cardinal Villot. Bunini is the man who was assigned by Paul VI to restructure the Mass and come up with the Novus Ordo. Marcinkus was the head of the Vatican Bank. Sunins was a major figure in Vatican II. Levi was with Osservatore Romano, the Vatican's newspaper. And Bea was the man that Malachi Martin worked for. And Malachi Martin told me personally, I got friendly with him as well, that he was no good. Put it mildly, he was no good. All right, so the article appeared. All right, now what happened? Remember now, this is right in the middle of the 34-day papacy of Pope John Paul I. He reigned for a mere 34 days. The article appeared right then. Did Pope John Paul I intend to look into the charges about Masonry? I think so. I don't know. I think so. But 2 weeks later, he was dead. There was no autopsy. Cardinal Villot, who was on the list, took personal charge of everything, cleaned up the papal apartments. If he had done that in the United States, he might have been prosecuted for disturbing a potential crime scene. But nothing was done. We live in the age of cover-ups, right? The cover-up of the death of John Kennedy, the cover-up of the shoot-down of KAL 007 with Congressman Larry McDonald aboard it, the cover-up here, the cover-up, here's a beautiful cover-up right here, right? And they got away with it. Now, what about Masonry? It was condemned by Pope Clement in 1738. It's been condemned by all subsequent popes up until John 23rd. Every pope issued a condemnation of Masonry. Now, I want to make the point that Masonry in Europe is far more revolutionary than what we know of Masonry here in the United States. I'm not excusing the leaders of Masonry in the United States. In the United States and in the West, the high percentage of Masons are victims of leaders, not conspirators, not even aware of the overall goal of their sect. I asked a man that I knew one time who was a Mason, I said to him, does Masonry keep you away from religion? And he thought about that a minute, and he said, it becomes a substitute for religion. And he finally said, yeah, you're right about that, it does. I said, well, then it's subversive. Very simple, right? So now Masonry supports the idea of world government, the United Nations. All right, now we're getting into the second part of my talk, right? Masonry, the revolution, said Fogazzaro of the larger Milan in about the year 1900, the revolution will have to be brought about in the name of obedience, right? Catholic people are obedient. And so we can do this, and we can do this, and we can do this, and we can accomplish the revolution because the Catholic people are obedient. So I wrote an article called Catholic Obedience, When You Do, When You Don't, When You Resist, right? As you should. Now, I don't suppose there are too many who have ever heard of Father Luigi Villa. Well, somebody has. He was a disciple of Padre Pio. Well, Padre Pio died in 1968. Before Padre Pio passed away, he went to Father Villa, and he gave him an assignment. I want you to catalog the writings and statements of John 23rd, who had already himself passed away, Paul VI, who was reigning as Pope, and the successors. So Father Villa did that very faithfully. He died in early 2003, just recently, right? And he published books about John 23rd, another book about Paul VI, another book about John Paul II. He didn't do one on John Paul I. 34 days, there wasn't much to write about. And those books are available from a group called Our Lady of Good Success in Oconomowoc, Wisconsin. Let me tell you that the books are devastating, right? And they should be known. The Catholic people need to know how we've been betrayed, right? Now let's get to the United Nations. Commonly held attitudes about the United Nations. I'm sure you've all run into people like this who say, oh, it's really only nothing, it's just for blowing off steam. They use the word bloviate. I love that word. And the United Nations never accomplished anything. And the United Nations, oh, all you need to do is reform it, get a new leader, right? But then they say, well, the United Nations is good because they feed hungry children. But they don't tell you that the money that goes to feed the children goes to the governments in these countries first. They skim off most of it, and then they use it to build themselves a gigantic bureaucracy that makes more hungry children, right? So it's just a loop. But these are the attitudes that are spread. The United Nations, in my view, is deadly, right? John Birch Society's been fighting for 50 years. Get us out of the United Nations, right? Now, the people who say the United Nations never accomplished anything can't explain to me what the people who fill that building in New York City do, right? They do something, right? Right? And the people in the International Monetary Fund in Washington, D.C., that's a pretty good-sized building, too, isn't it? They do something. And then the International Labor Organization in Geneva, Switzerland, that's a pretty big building, too. They fill that one, and they're busy doing something. And here's the World Health Organization back in Geneva, and here's the International Criminal Court in The Hague in the Netherlands. And all these buildings are full of people doing something, and the United Nations does nothing? Oh, wait a minute. Back up a little bit, right? And then the World Bank, we're back in Washington, D.C. Now, the Food and Agriculture UN organizations in Rome, the World Health Organization in Geneva, Seabed Authority in Jamaica, Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, Maritime Organization in London, plus more agencies, more organizations, more buildings in Tokyo and Bangkok and Montreal and Paris and Nairobi and so forth, but they all do nothing. No, they don't, right? The United Nations is building the mechanism to take control of mankind. The cost to U.S. taxpayers in one single year is $7 billion. That's money's not that important, right? Now let's look at the UN versus the U.S. Of course, I'm a U.S. citizen. I know some of you Canadians, maybe you know this. Our Declaration of Independence says men are endowed by their Creator with rights. And to secure these rights, governments are instituted. God's on top, individuals next with their powers. They form a government. For what purpose? Protect rights, nothing more, right? Protect rights. Government should be a negative force, not a positive for going around doing things for people, because when they start doing that, they take control of people, right? And then they come out with the Bill of Rights. Congress shall make no law about these. I love the 10th Amendment, which in effect says, if we forgot anything, you can't do that either, right? So here's the UN, 1948. Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Everyone shall be subject only to such limitations as are determined by law. In other words, you have all these rights, but we can pass a law that says you don't have them. And then they did the same thing again in '66 with the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Rights may be subject to certain restrictions, but these shall be as such are provided by law and are necessary. Constitution of the Soviet Union, 1955, same thing. All the rights are listed, and you can read that and you say, oh, well, that's wonderful. All people have all these rights and everything. But at the end of it, it says we can pass a law that says you don't. And in the Soviet Union, they certainly did that, didn't they? Right? So, polar opposites. United States, God. United Nations, no God. United States, rights from God. United Nations, rights from government. United States, no law to impede the rights. United Nations, law at whim to cancel them out. Right? I should take a vote at this point. Does anybody want to get out of the United Nations? Right? I said this man, Edward Mandell House, was the godfather of the United Nations. He wrote a book in 1912 called Philip Drew, Administrator, and it's his political philosophy in the book. How interesting that the dedicatory quote in the book is from Giuseppe Mazzini. How interesting, the head of the Carbonari. He was an advisor to Presidents Wilson and FDR. He actually took control of Wilson. He said in his book he wanted socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx. He despised the U.S. Constitution. He advocated income tax and Federal Reserve. He proposed world government, and he launched the Council on Foreign Relations. Other than that, this man did nothing. 1919, the U.S. Senate voted, do we approve the League of Nations? They debated the matter for 9 months, and they said no. Thank God for that. Thank God for that, right? Well, 1942 to 1945, I think you all know that Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7th, 1941. Within a month, diplomats were getting together in Washington, D.C., to plan the United Nations. Everybody else in the country was mobilizing. Guys are going into service, giving up their jobs, saying goodbye to their families, they're going off to war. Right? But they put out a Declaration of the United Nations in 1942, and that's the first time the term was publicly used, the United Nations. In 1943, the US, the UK, USSR, and China agreed to form a world government. Right? 1944, at the famous Dumbarton Oaks Conference. Dumbarton Oaks is a big state in Washington, D.C., created the initial draft of the UN Charter. And in May of 1945, for 2 months, May, June, and July, the San Francisco Conference, attended by representatives of 50 nations, produced the final UN Charter, right? The founding of the UN. The U.S. delegation contains 16 communists, 43 members of the Council on Foreign Relations. I don't think there was a genuine American amongst all of them. And the chairman of the commission, the conference, was Alger Hiss, who was later found to be a secret communist, right? So the chief authors of the UN Charter, Andrei Vyshinsky of the USSR, an open communist, and Alger Hiss of the United States, a secret communist. Is it a loaded deck? Boy, I'll say, right? Now, the 19th Senate, in 1945, the Senate decided to vote on whether to accept the charter and put our country into the United Nations. Remember, in 1919, the Senate debated it for 9 months and said no. In 1945, they debated it for 6 days and said yes by a vote of 89 to 2. Only 2 senators said no. And I'm sure you've all heard of Henrik Shipstead of Minnesota and William Langer of North Dakota. Right? No, you haven't, right? Well, someday we're going to build a monument to those 2 men. Shipstead said control of the war power must remain in Congress. He saw that. I went and dug out the speeches that these 2 men gave. William Langer of North Dakota said the UN would have the authority to send our boys all over the earth. Right? Let's look at the charter. Article 1 uses the word peace 6 times. And so they call themselves a peace organization. But Article 2 authorizes war. It didn't take long to turn on the peace, right? Article 2 discusses the application of enforcement measures under Chapter 7. So you go to Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, and what do you see? It authorizes demonstrations, blockade, and other operations by air, sea, or land forces of the United Nations. In that war, isn't that what war is all about, right? So the United Nations favors war in order to bring about peace. Peace to a communist has always been the absence of opposition. Peace to the United Nations is the same, the absence of opposition. Right? Now, let's say you're a member of the United States Senate in 1945. The charter comes, you're supposed to vote on it, and you read through the charter, and would you, as a United States Senator, agree to this? The entire Article 25 is right there. The members of the United Nations agree to accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council in accordance with the present charter. Would you, as a United States Senator, have said yes to that? Right? Of course not, right? But 89 did, and only 2 said no. Right? Now, why? Well, I'm old enough to remember that time, right? I was a little more than just a tot in 1945. And I can remember the attitude sweeping the United States that we've had World War I, we've had World War II, we don't want World War III, we got to try something different. And that's the way it was sold. Try something new, something different. Even my own dad, a very patriotic American, he said, yeah, let's give it a try. I don't know, he didn't read the charter. They didn't make the charter available to people. And so it swept the country, and 89 senators said yes. Right? Now, how does the UN get its military arm? Well, Article 43 says all members of the United Nations undertake to make available to the Security Council armed forces, assistance, and facilities, including the rites of passage necessary for the purpose of maintaining international peace and security. Right? So all member nations are required by the Charter to send troops when the Security Council says we need troops. Right? Who does most of that? The United States. Right? His Secretary of State, Colin Powell, is a man who should have been fired on the spot. He said, with respect to U.S. policy, when it comes to our role as a member of the Security Council, we are obviously bound by UN resolutions, right? Obviously bound, right? He's the one that they gave the speech to demonstrate that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. They made a fool of him, and he let him do it, right? And he's still supporting those punches. Here's George H.W. Bush. It is the sacred principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter to which the American people will henceforth pledge their allegiance. Sacred principles? Isn't that a bit over the top? Right? Just a bit, right? Now, something else happened in 1945 that's very significant. the Congress of the United States was asked to pass the United Nations Participation Act. And part of the United Nations Participation Act said, the President shall not be deemed to require authorization of Congress to send troops to enforce Security Council resolutions. Right? There was another part of it that said, the President is not permitted to commit some of our troops to a standing army of the United Nations. No. The United Nations have never had a standing army. They don't need one. They got the U.S. The U.S. always supplies the troops, right? So this was being discussed in December of 1945, and here's a woman congressman from Illinois, Jessie Sumner, who said it. She nailed it. She said, this measure gives a congressional authority for surrendering the American people to an all-powerful super government. Right on. She was a real estate broker and a lawyer, right? Here's a doctor over in Ohio named Frederick Smith. He came out and he said, this measure strikes at the very heart of the Constitution. It provides that the power to declare war shall be taken from the Congress and given to the President. Here is the essence of dictatorship. Right? Good for you, Frederick Smith, right? So they voted in the House of Representatives, and the vote was 344 to 50. Only 15 members of the House of Representatives rejected this. And the Senate approved it later. Right? Senator Robert Taft, a man whom my dad revered and I grew to know a lot about and respected, even he voted for the UN Charter. And only a little while later, he said the UN has become a trap, let's go it alone, right? And then he started fighting against the UN, which is why he was denied the Republican nomination for president in 1952. Now go back to the Charter. UN Charter, Articles 52, 3, and 4 talk about the creation of regional arrangements. That's their term. A regional arrangement like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, or SCA, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, CETO. And each of these say Security Council shall utilize such regional arrangements for enforcement action under its authority, and the Security Council shall be kept fully informed of activities. Is NATO part of the United Nations? Yes, it always has been. It's a subsidiary of the United Nations. We were told that it was formed to keep the Soviet Union from moving further west after they'd conquered Poland and Czechoslovakia and Lithuania and Latvia and all those countries. No, no. Secretary of State Dean Acheson at the time said NATO is an essential measure for strengthening the United Nations. Right? He said that in 1949 when the vote to approve NATO was taken. So it was created in 1949. It derives its authority to exist from the United Nations Charter, and only 13 senators, led by Taft, by the way, voted no. And now NATO, with 28 members, is now in charge of the Afghan war. Right? Any wonder why we're not triumphing? Any wonder why we didn't triumph in Vietnam? Let's go back. Let's go back to the Korean War. 1950, North Korea, communist North Korea invades South Korea, non-communists, right? Security Council passed a resolution. All members send forces. U.S. supplied most of the forces, most of the equipment, and there was no declaration of war. Here we are at war in Korea, and there's no declaration of war as required by the Constitution. So they went to President Truman and they said, what about this? Where's the declaration of war? He said, we're not at war. This is a police action. And then he said this, if I can send troops to NATO, I can send troops to Korea, right? Using the precedent. UN flags were actually flying over the US troops in Korea in 1950-51. General MacArthur, whom I also revere, he ordered more flags to come. He needed more UN flags. And then they found out that the UN was inhibiting what they were doing and those flags started coming down. A lot of them at midnight when a couple of angry troops went up and commandeered the flag. Right? That state of war in Korea ended in the shooting part of it in 1953, but it still exists. U.S. troops are still in South Korea. Tens of thousands of American troops are still in South Korea under the United Nations mandate. And General George Stratemeyer, one of the generals that we were required to lose the Korean War. Yeah, right. This is terrifyingly interesting here. General MacArthur, who commanded our troops in Korea, was replaced for wanting to win. In his book, Reminiscences, he quoted the Chinese general, After a time, the Chinese forces came across the border from Manchuria. They outnumbered our people 20-1, and it looked like it was going to be slaughter, right? But he quoted General Lin Piao, the Chinese general who brought those troops from Manchuria. And Lin Piao said, "I would never have made the attack and risked my men and military reputation if I had not been assured that Washington would restrain General MacArthur." Right? So who restrained General MacArthur? Well, the State Department, the Council on Foreign Relations members in the State Department, working with the United Nations, they restrained General MacArthur. And his protest led to his being summarily dismissed. Southeast Asia Treaty, same as NATO, created in 1954 by John Foster Dulles, one of the founders with Edward Mandell House of the Council on Foreign Relations, cited as authorization to place U.S. troops in Vietnam. Lyndon Johnson was president during that period. And in 1967, he answered a question. He said, "We are in Vietnam because the United States and our allies are committed by the SEATO Treaty to act to meet the common danger of aggression in Southeast Asia." Right? So I'm not making this up, right? NATO, the UN directed the war in Korea. SEATO directed the war in Vietnam. Vietnam, finally, the rules of engagement that were mandated for our troops. Senator Barry Goldwater finally unearthed them. He put them in the congressional record in 1985, many years later. And the rules of engagement: don't attack enemy planes on the ground. Don't attack truck convoys if they turn off the highway. Don't close Haiphong Harbor. You imagine a pilot, and he's told that he can't attack a plane that could very easily come up and go after him. He can't attack it if it's on the ground. He has to wait till he's being attacked in the air. We lost the Korean War. It's the first time in history America completely lost the war. Desert Storm, 1991. President George H.W. Bush. The crisis in Gulf has to do with a new world order. How significant that was, right? He said it over and over again, and he said that new world order is only going to be enhanced if this newly activated peacekeeping function of the UN proves to be effective, right? When he started talking new world order, and he did it over and over and over again, our phones were ringing. People were saying, "You've been saying this for years, that they're after a new world order. I guess I better join the Birch Society." Right? Well, yeah, we did get some members because of that. All right, now Desert Storm in 1991. It's the first attack on Iraq, right? And the goal was to get Saddam Hussein's forces out of Kuwait, where he'd invaded, and that just started the war. So the war, all of a sudden, it stopped suddenly in a matter of weeks. Why? Why not go all the way to Baghdad if you think Saddam Hussein's a bad guy? The UN Security Council that authorized that action allowed only to get Saddam Hussein's forces out of Kuwait, and that's why they stopped, right? And of course, strengthened the United Nations. The second Iraq War occurred in 2003, right? And here's a letter from to the U.S. Security Council from Ambassador to the UN, John Negroponte. And it starts off by saying, "The actions are being taken are authorized by existing Council resolutions 678, 687, and so on." I mean, they let you know where's the authority coming from. There's a very important principle involved here. One seeks authorization not from an inferior, but a superior. Who's the superior? The United Nations. Who's the inferior? The United States and all other nations in the United Nations. There are now 193 members in the United Nations. Some of them you could fit in this room, the people in them. Afghanistan war is under NATO. They've made that very plain, but they don't tell you what NATO is all about. There's General Petraeus, he disgraced himself. There's a dead body coming back. There's some of our troops. So summarize, the UN wars. In 1950, the Korean War, the UN flags were flying. Vietnam War, SEATO was in charge. Desert Storm, UN authorization. Second Iraq War, UN authorization. Afghan War, NATO. Who's running the story here? The United Nations. On October 3rd of 2002, now this is 6 months before the second invasion of Iraq, which occurred in March of 2003. The House International Relations Committee got together, and Ron Paul, the member of the committee, 45 members there, he got up and he said, Mr. Chairman, I move that we declare war on Iraq, and I intend to vote against my measure because I don't think we should go to war against Iraq. But he said, I also don't think we should ignore the constitutional requirement for a congressional declaration of war. Right? Well, you had the pleasure of meeting Ron Paul last night. There's nobody else in the Congress that would do what he did in this situation. You know? So they discussed the matter, and Congressman Henry Hyde of Chicago, a good Catholic, they say, right, from Chicago. I don't know if you can be if you're a politician from Chicago, but you remember the story about the old fellow who said, when I die, please bury me in Chicago so I can remain politically active? Henry Hyde said to Ron, there are things in the Constitution that have been overtaken by events, by time. Declaration of war is one of them. Your measure is inappropriate, anachronistic, it isn't done anymore. Right? Now, these people all take an oath to support the Constitution of the United States. Well, what does that mean? You know? That's just a formality. Taking an oath doesn't mean anything. So they voted, and they voted in favor of going ahead to invade Iraq the second time. Gun foes want civilian disarmament, and the United Nations came up with an arms trade treaty, and it was defeated. But it'll come back again. Now, outside the United Nations headquarters in New York City, you will see a huge statue. It's probably 20 feet high, and it's a great big wide thing. It's just a picture of it here. And it's a pistol with a knot at the end of the barrel. It's tied a knot in it, right? To say that the United Nations is a peace organization and we don't want anybody to own a gun. What's significant about this is that is a civilian weapon. That's a Colt revolver. It's not a military weapon. It's a Colt revolver that they've managed to extend the barrel and then tie it in a knot so that it can't be used. Right? The United Nations is very much after everybody's right to own a weapon. Now, Article 2 of the Charter, in paragraph 7, says, nothing in the present Charter shall authorize the UN to intervene in matters which are essentially within the jurisdiction of any state. Do they violate that? Well, here's their organizational chart, and you can find every aspect of human life mentioned there. There's a bureau for this and a commission for that, women, children, food, you name it, right? The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund are there, and so on, right? So they're intervening everywhere. They intervened in Katanga in 1961. When the UN came in and bombed the civilian hospitals and the people and so forth, and the 46 doctors of that province of the Congo that was trying to be independent, get away from a communist leader, the UN came in and smithereens. And 46 doctors wrote a book. The title of the book is 46 Angry Men. They sent a copy to President Kennedy. They sent a copy to every leader in Europe, and they sent a copy to the Pope, and nothing happened. They've intervened in Rhodesia, and we've seen the destruction of that nation. It's now Zimbabwe. In Australia, they intervened, and they stopped a hydroelectric power plant. In Guatemala, they wanted the people in Guatemala to change their constitution for abortion. The United Nations pushing this. European Union destroying the sovereignty. It's all a UN operation. International Monetary Fund and World Bank, are they buying loyalties? Are they buying people? Are they buying politics? Oh, absolutely, right. In the U.S., the UN has spoken out about what laws we do have against abortion. They wanted to get rid of them. They stopped a mining project up in Montana because it was near Yellowstone Park. Right? They don't like the fact that we do have still some capital punishment here in the United States. They especially don't like our border control policies, and I don't like them either. They're not strong enough. Right? They have rendered judicial decisions that have superiority over our own laws. And they want to go after the right to be armed, right? A lawyer out in California, former justice of the California Supreme Court, He says, someday it will be malpractice for lawyers to fail to include UN human rights law in their cases. That's where we're heading. Agenda 21, you've probably heard of this. This is the United Nations stealth operation. This is the forward to the book. It's a 1,000-page book. Agenda 21 proposes an array of actions which are intended to be implemented by every person on earth. Effective execution will require a profound reorientation of all human society, unlike anything the world has ever experienced. Right? In the name of sustainable development, in the name of green something. I hate when they use green. I'm Irish. They shouldn't use green. But they do. Agenda 21 now, they had already accomplished going to communities across the United States. They got 600 of them to sign on this thing without telling them that it was a UN operation. Well, we got involved in this thing, and our members started going to people here and there. More than 100 of them have resigned from the Agenda 21 program. And our effect has been so dramatic that the New York Times ran a front-page article on a Sunday edition, and it said, the John Birch Society is doing this and this. Good. Say it again. Say it more and more and more, right? Now they have Common Core for the educational system. Arnie Duncan, the Secretary of Education. Our goal for the coming year will be to work closely with global partners, including UNESCO, to promote qualitative improvement and system strengthening, right? Common Core is a complete destruction of the educational system in our country. Now they're replacing the 3 R's. It used to be reading, writing, and arithmetic, and now it's recycling, racism, and reproduction. Now, this is hard to believe. I think many of you have heard of a man named Jacques Cousteau, right? A little Frenchman going around in his boat, the apocalypse. He said this in an article that was published in the United Nations Courier in Paris. It's terrible to have to say this. World population must be stabilized, and to do that, we must eliminate 350,000 people per day. They want to go from 7 billion people down to less than 1 billion people. Right? And he has contributed to that. He's now dead. Right? Here's a man I greatly revered. I got to know him well. I worked alongside him. He died in 1985. Right? And he said over and over, withdraw the United States from the United Nations and you will have broken the back of the world conspiracy. If the United States pulls out, that will signal to country after country after country. Right? They need the United States. We're working hard to get the American people to appreciate, get us out of the Union. Now, I get accused of being a conspiracy theorist. Right? And I always say I'm not. I'm a conspiracy factist. Right? Right? Here's a great quote of a man named James Lucier. I should have put his name on it. The first job of conspiracy is to convince the world that conspiracy does not exist, right? That's brilliant. So you go to a neighbor, you go to a coworker, you go to a friend, maybe even your spouse, and you start talking, you sound like a conspiracy theorist, right? Oh, they've got people saying that all across the country, right? And that helps to try to prove that conspiracy does not exist. Here's Robert Welching, and what did he say? There's a conspiracy at work as sure as there's a law of gravity, right? I love that summation, right? So let's summarize. Now, I'm talking about the U.S. leaders here, America's leaders. They're not stupid bunglers, right? They're not lacking information. What's the only other alternative? They know what they're doing and what it leads to. And we can supply books and evidence and speeches and whatever to show people who they are and how they should be ignored and deposed from their positions and so forth, right? We've got a steep hill still to climb, but we're at it, and there's a sustainability within the Birch Society that's very admirable. So let's make some conclusions. The United Nations is not taking over the United States. But the United States is being delivered to the United Nations. That's the way it has to be looked at, not the first part. They're not taking us over. They'd be powerless without the United States. Our leaders are delivering our country to the United Nations. Same thing. Conclusion number 2. Membership in the United Nations is completely incompatible with an independent United States and the freedom of the American people and the entire world, right? Including Canada, right? Right. Conclusion number 3. Reform. Should we reform the UN? You don't reform cancer. You cut it out. How about reduce our payments? Well, what the heck, you know? The Federal Reserve will print some more money under the table and slip it to them. That's no problem, right? Friendlier Secretary General. Huh? Is that the answer? No. What's the answer? There it is. That's a billboard in Arizona. And I don't mean this blasphemy, but I asked the guy who was driving the car when we came up to the billboard, I said, "Can you stop, please? I want to get out and genuflect." We should have those all across our country. You should have them all across Canada. Get us out of the United Nations. We want to retain our independence. We want to be an independent nation, and so forth, right? Now, there's a bill in the U.S. Congress, H.R. 75, introduced by Representative Paul Brown, B-R-O-U-N, American Sovereignty Restoration Act. It's a duplicate of the bill that Ron Paul introduced year after year after year. And it's a measure to provide for complete withdrawal of the United States from the United Nations, right? Now, it's in committee, and it's not going to go anywhere. We know that this year, but we're building the sentiment where a congressman is going to be put on, a guy running for Congress is going to be put on record. Do you support the United Nations, or do you support getting out of the United Nations and put some of these people on record? And that can be done, right? First item in that bill is repeal of the United Nations Participation Act, right? That most people have never heard of, right? John Birch Society offers rock-solid information, 5 decades of experience, sorely needed national organization, and a plan for victory. I wrote a little book, and it's for sale out there on one of the tables. Way on the right wing, by the way. I'm on the right wing, right? It's about how the U.S. got in the UN and why we should withdraw. So there are some out there, and if you feel like making a donation, I'm not allowed to charge for it. Right? All right, so those commonly held attitudes are wrong. It's not just a forum for blowing off steam. It's not something that's never accomplished anything. It's not where they need to get better leaders, and it's not a place to talk rather than fight. That to me bothers me. The last of those 4 bothers me more than the others, because let's suppose you have a spat with a neighbor country, all right? So you take it to the UN, and now instead of involving you and your neighbor country, you're involving 193 nations in the whole problem. That's pretty stupid, isn't it? Right? So, place to talk rather than fight? No, no, no. Why do we have an ambassador in the capital city of almost all nations of the world? We don't need the UN. So the choice is ours. Less government or world government? U.S. Constitution or UN Charter? God or no God? A better world or a new world order? Pope Paul VI once said that the United Nations is man's best hope for peace. I winced when I saw that, right? St. Robert Bellarmine is one of my heroes. Doctor of the church. Lived the late 1500s into the early 1600s. And he addressed this point, which is why I wrote an article about Catholic obedience, when you do and when you don't, and when you resist. He said, just as it is licit to resist the pontiff who attacks the body, so it is licit to resist him who attacks souls, or who disturbs the civil order, or even more, who tries to destroy the church. Could a pope try to destroy the church? Robert Bellarmine said it was possible. He went on and he said, it is not licit, however, to judge him, to punish him, or depose him, for such acts belong to a superior. And I put down there, no sedevacantism, right? I am not a sedevacantist. I pray for the Pope. I want you to do it. In the Latin Tridentine Mass, there's a point where you get to a place where you're talking about Peter, Linus, Cletus, Clement, Sixtus, right? Early popes. Pray to them for them to help Pope Francis, right? Now, a final note here. I think everybody in the room knows about the Feast of Cana. There's a great lesson in there that isn't always talked about. And the lesson is this: do all you can do up to the time you can't do anymore, and then ask for God's help, right? When the Blessed Mother went to the men, fill the water jars, right? Do what you can do up to the point you can't do anymore, and then Christ came along and changed the water into wine. Right? But you have to do everything you can do. You can't just sit around and moan about it. You can't just say, well, it's somebody else's job. You've got to get involved. And so we have the choice of one world government and one world religion, or independent nations with God on top. Thank you very much. You've been very kind to me.
I have come to warn the faithful to amend their lives and ask pardon for their sins. They must not continue to offend our Lord, who is already deeply offended. In the final vision on October 13, 1917, Our Lady silently held out the scapular, a gesture which indicates that she wants everyone to wear it. In the final vision on October 13, 1917, Our Lady silently held out the scapular, a gesture which indicates that she wants everyone to wear it. Pray a great deal and make sacrifices for sinners, for many souls go to hell because they have no one to make sacrifices and pray for them. Our Lady said to Sister Lucia of Fatima, "I promise to assist at the hour of death with all the graces necessary for salvation. All those who on the first Saturday of 5 consecutive months go to confession, receive Holy Communion, recite 5 decades of the Rosary, and keep me company for 15 minutes while meditating on the mysteries of the Rosary, with the intention of making reparation to me." Pray the Rosary every day to obtain peace for the world. Our Lady said, "If my requests are not heeded, Russia will spread her errors throughout the world, raising up wars and persecutions against the Church. The good will be martyred. The Holy Father will have much to suffer, and various nations will be annihilated.